Crisis webinar series. My name is Lai Butaki, and I'm the Director of Communication and Outreach for Academia 2063. And it's always a delight and an honor to host attendees from all over the world as we continue to discuss the socioeconomic impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war on African economies based on Academia 2063's research, which fits into our Ukraine Crisis Brief series, available on academia2063.org. For this session, we are going to discuss as the theme, the impacts on commodity markets in Zimbabwe. And as always, we are looking forward to a highly interactive and engaging conversation. Please head to the chat and tell us your name, tell us the organization you represent, and what you hope to see take away from these sessions. And of course, if you have any questions, reflections, contributions, please head to the Q&A, drop them there, and they'll be brought to the floor by the moderator during this conversation. As always, we invite you to raise your hand if you wish to intervene live, and the moderator will invite you to take the floor. We are providing simultaneous interpretation in English and French. If you need this function, please click on the globe icon on your screen. And as always, we are equally live streaming on our YouTube channel, Academia 2063. Now it's my pleasure to welcome our moderator for today. He wears several hats. He is Director of Research at the Indaba Agricultural Policy Research Institute. He's equally technical chair at ANAPRI and interim CEO at the Center for Agriculture and Food Policy, Zimbabwe. Please welcome our moderator, Dr. Anthony Chapoto.
Thank you very, very much, Lai. It's a pleasure, colleagues who are online, to have this session today. I am very pleased that we have a brilliant colleague, Dr. Grino Machaya, who is going to make a short presentation, and then we can have a discussion around that presentation. And as Lai indicated, I think the Russia-Ukraine war has brought some issues, I think, in terms of interrupting supply chains in the globe. Particularly Africa has not been spared in terms of issues to do with fertilizer, wheat, and fuels. So I'm hoping that I think this case study for Zimbabwe will provide more evidence on the table so that we can start to discuss recommendations on how to deal with the implications of the Russia-Ukraine war. So without wasting time, let me introduce our speaker today. His name is Dr. Grino Machaya. He is currently a senior international researcher in economics at the International Water Management Institute, IMWI, and based in Johannesburg. And IMWI is a constituent member of the Consultative Group of International Agricultural Research, the XVI system. And he's also a coordinator of the Regional Strategic Analysis and Knowledge Support Systems Program for Eastern and Southern Africa region, that's RESAX. And prior to joining the CG group, Grino worked at the University of Reading and University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. But basically, Grino is an economist really interested in development issues. His PhD was from University of Leeds, UK, MA also University of Leeds, and his MSc was from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. So you can see that we are dealing with a fundi here. So Dr. Grino Machaya, please, you have 20 minutes to make a short presentation based on the brief that you produced on Zimbabwe, after which we'll open up the session for discussions. So Grino, please, welcome, and you have 20 minutes.
Thanks very much, Dr. Chapoto, as well as Dr. Laibutake. Well, I didn't know that you set me up there, Dr. Chapoto and Laibutake, for in the introductions. I mean, it was a long introduction. But anyway, let's get started. I'm going to share my presentation now. Please let me know if you can see something there.
Perfect, we can see.
Okay, perfect. All right, so thanks very much. This presentation really is about the impact of the Ukraine crisis on commodity markets in Africa. It's part of the series of studies that we are conducting at academia and research across the continent in order to understand what is happening. And I have to say also that it's dependent on the data that we collected in the initial days of the crisis. So some of the results should be should be interpreted within that kind of context. The outline of this presentation is as follows. So first we talk about the introduction, then the objectives, then a brief on methods and results, and then key messages. So as we already know, I think most countries, or almost every country, there's no country that is an island. Either it's related to another through language or through infrastructure, or either through political connections or through trade and other businesses, culture, etc. The implication of that is that when something happens in one country, then those which are related to that country are likely going to also suffer or benefit from whatever is happening elsewhere. When you talk about crisis, it means if one country is suffering, the other countries will also kind of suffer because of those natural interconnectedness of nations. And so when the war in Ukraine and Russia started, it was not surprising to see that other countries had already started voicing concerns that the crisis was affecting their countries. And for Russia and Ukraine, it's even special because the two countries are great players on the global trade for agricultural commodities as well as for agriculture outputs as well as imports. So for example, the two countries account for a larger share of sunflower oil and seed, wheat, as well as barley and maize trade. Jointly, they account for about 27% of global wheat trade and about 23% of maize trade, as well as 14% of global barley trade. So those are significant shares. That if something happens to them, then not only the countries that trade with them are going to feel that, but even those which trade with them indirectly are going to feel that. And beyond Russia and Ukraine, therefore, the impact of the war that is taking place there may be felt by countries through a number of ways, one or more of the ways that I'm going to talk about here. So the first one is that if you're trading directly with Russia and Ukraine, the fact that they were closing borders that time, you are going to be affected as a nation because then you're not going to receive the supplies from them as usual. So there'll be supply disruptions. But secondly, even if you're not trading with them directly, but you are maybe trading with countries that trade with them directly, then you are going to also be affected, maybe with a lag, but you still be affected because those who import commodities from Russia before they export to you are going to have fewer supplies. This is important because I think in is it Badian, Fofana and Sao that they showed also 2022 that many countries in Africa appear to be importing more than they need domestically simply because they want to re-export the others to other countries. So meaning that even if you don't trade directly with Russia and Ukraine, you're going to suffer because you might have been relying on another country that trades. It will prioritize its own consumption. And thirdly, due to concerns about future shortages some countries that time started holding or withholding trade, banning trade. I think there were many: Argentina, Egypt, India, Brazil, etc. All those were Turkey were announcing some kind of bans in vegetable trade, as well as some fertilizers, etc. So even if you don't trade directly with Russia and you don't trade with the country that trades with Russia, you might still be affected, because now another country that does not do anything with Russia has just decided that they want to wait and see. They're not going to export to you. And fourthly, increasing fuel prices, transport, and general trade transaction that came as a result of the war, they put pressure on commodity prices, leading to price hikes. And such kind of increases mean that they do not discriminate. Any country can suffer from them. Russia is a great player on the fuel market. Once it is busy or it has been banned by Europeans because of the war, European and Western nations, then obviously it means now the supply of fuel on the international market is low. Because it's low, prices are going to go up, and they are going to affect any country, even that which does not directly trade with Russia and the Ukraine. So we can already start thinking about the implications of that for net importers of commodities from Russia or the affected commodities, wherever they might be from. It means they're likely going to be affected even more, because they are net importers. Then they are likely going to face higher prices of imports more than they face prices of or enjoy higher prices of exports. The impact will be on their current accounts. They're going to have larger deficits. They're going to fail to supply future imports of things. And that is going to have general ramifications on the macroeconomy and affecting any other sectors that one might even not think about. So the Russia and Ukraine war has destabilized markets within Russia, within Ukraine, within the war zone, as well as beyond the war zone. It is expected that unless significant efforts are taken to introduce further supplies from elsewhere, the further the war is fought between Russia and Ukraine, the more intensely we are also going to see price changes that are not normal, and in some cases even price increases. Now, studies like these ones I think are important. We saw during the COVID crisis that countries were waiting for information on how they think they should react given that crisis. That time, the problem was that of demand. Demand plummeted because markets closed. In this case as well, the markets are open, but supply has gone down because of trade bans and the almost like practical impossibility of getting some things from Russia and Ukraine. The questions that countries were asking us were, how do we act and what is happening? So just to try and understand that, we thought that having such kind of studies is kind of important, because then you can start seeing which markets, local markets, you have to intervene in, or where do you have to intervene and how. If you looked at the changes, the changes that took place on the world markets when the war just started, so between January and maybe before June, we see that crude oil prices were increasing. So here you'd see that crude oil prices from month to month, they were increasing, okay, with some exceptions where you see negatives, but in general, the total change of prices during that time for crude oil was almost 30%, so increasing by 30%. If you look at liquefied gas by 12%, maize prices also increased internationally by 23%, rice by about 10%, wheat by about 36%, not surprising given that Ukraine and Russia are significant players there, and beef about 2%, sugar about 7%, sunflower by an overwhelming 51%, given that also we know Ukraine and Russia are significant players there on that market. So those general price changes as a result of the global market disruptions during the war, the initial days of the war, also had significant repercussions. But the question was, what were they in essence in your own country? Because I think that's what matters. I mean, those global changes are important, but if you do not know exactly how they're affecting your country, I think you, as a policymaker, you have nothing to do. You just speculate. So these kind of studies we thought were important because they, even though they might not tell you everything you need to know, but at least they bring you closer to what is happening in your countries. So the objectives of this brief were to analyze price trends for selected commodities in the local markets in Zimbabwe, draw some insights that may be useful for limiting the impacts thereof. And then we were also using data from Zimbabwe's market information system, as well as the World Bank, to perform those analysis and of changes over time and compare with the changes on the world markets. And in some cases also try to apply some methods like difference calculations just to see whether the changes we're seeing were indeed unique, because one would say, okay, maybe they were still supposed to just change anyway. But this difference in different estimators were also useful in terms of trying to firm up what our hypotheses are, that the changes are due to the uniqueness of 2022, which is the war that took place. I must say a priori here also that we would have loved to even do further analysis as we do with other, we did with other in other countries, but I think some of the methods we were not able to apply them here because of data issues. So one of the issues that we can take home here is that for the case of Zimbabwe, we need to intensify data collection efforts. There is some kind of a gap in some of the markets. We do not have enough data, but I think if we can have a consistent effort to strengthen data systems there, going forward, when similar crises happen, then we would be able to subject data to analysis of various kinds, given that the data is available. So some of the results that we're seeing are as follows. So here, this is just a compilation of the wheat situation in Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe is a net wheat importer. I think as of 2019, we saw that they were importing about 200,000. The demand for imports were about 200,000. And I think the total consumption was about 300,000 consumption demand, meaning that the deficit was about 67%. This situation hasn't really changed that much. There is still a significant amount of deficit in terms of wheat production. So the production is lower than the consumption demand every year. And but most of this wheat comes from other countries rather than Russia. However, Russia and Ukraine still account for about 22% in 2019. And this has also continued to 2020, I think. But I wanted to use the reliable information that we kind of obtained. So what we're saying here is that given this kind of structure of the wheat market, production and consumption in Zimbabwe, it is not surprising that the war in Ukraine and Russia is likely going to have some impacts on wheat prices in Zimbabwe. And indeed, this figure shows price trends during that time, during the first initial months of the war. So wheat prices were highest, firstly, in the urban markets of Mbare and Rankin for the markets that we studied, but they were lowest also in the rural markets of Chipingwe and Hwedza. But after the second week of 2022, when the war, second week of April, prices started changing significantly. I think they were increasing in all the markets, almost mimicking this graph here, which is also the graph for the price for wheat. So the prices for wheat in Zimbabwe started increasing significantly. This may be explained by the high the increase, though. You can take a look at it from two perspectives. The ones that are highest here, the highest ones are the urban markets, whereas the ones that are increasing but at a not so fast rate are the rural markets. Seems like people in the urban centers are suffering more in this case in terms of price changes than the ones in rural areas. So the explanation is to do with a dependency on imports that is characteristic of rural markets as compared to urban, of urban markets as compared to rural markets. And prices in urban markets rose by about 34% over that period of January to May 2022, but they rose by about 25% in the rural markets. I might be interchanging things when I explain, but urban markets in general saw a huge rise in prices of wheat as compared to rural markets. And the explanation is to do with high incomes in urban centers, as well as the import dependency in urban centers in the wake of scarcity on the international market. So these increases, as I said, they are kind of comparable to the 36% increase in the world markets, as we already said. So it's they kind of, we can say they are related to the Ukraine crisis. If you look at sugar prices, again, comparing urban markets of Zimbabwe and rural markets, these ones in the middle here are the rural market prices. The ones up here are the urban market prices. Zimbabwe is a net sugar exporter with a trade surplus of over 73 million in 2020, just to demonstrate that they export sugar. But sugar prices are generally higher in the urban centers as compared to the rural markets, just as in wheat. And also the changes that we saw after the war started in Ukraine were higher. They were higher and more price increases in the urban markets as compared to rural markets. I think this can also be seen here. So the differences are again to do with the dependency on imports of rural market or of urban markets as compared to the rural markets. And of course, the changes coinciding with the changes on the world markets are partly driven by the war in Ukraine. If you see that the average price increase,
5 minutes.
Okay, so then if you go to rice and maize prices also, you find that for rice and maize prices, rice prices were generally decreasing over time, but the maize prices appear to be increasing over time. When you look at the world market prices, you find also that they were increasing over the same period. I think they increased by 23% on the world stage. And I think this is also that increase appears to also be explained by the war, or at least can be attributed to the war. The red meat prices, a lot of stuff happening here, some of which cannot be explained in terms of the significant changes in prices, but I think over time the prices started declining. It's on the world market, the prices for red meat also declined, and I wonder why. Maybe it's a question of households trying to substitute or to focus on something that they think is more important, because probably red meat is taken as a luxury in other places. But this can have significant implications as well, because if households are switching away from that, then we might see cases of kind of malnourishment. If you look at oil prices, cooking oil prices, these were also increasing over time, again, more in the urban centers than in the rural areas. But the increase is also in such a way that it mimics the increase on the international stage, which means that there is something to do with the war in as far as the prices of cooking oil are concerned in Zimbabwe. For the energy prices, there is really, apart from this kind of significant variation here, which in some cases I tried to see whether it was due to data quality, but I checked every time I find I'm given the same kind of data from Zimbabwe. But apart from that, you find that the changes, the increase in prices are there, but they're kind of almost steady. And for both petrol and diesel, and in both rural and the urban markets. So part of the reason why there's this steady increase is because in Zimbabwe, I think there was an attempt to subsidize the sector, and they reduced the import taxes there, plus also any increases were kind of almost programmed. So to some extent, this reduced the volatility there. But the increases are commensurate with what was happening on the international markets. This is just a summary of what I've already said. The rural markets are, the urban markets kind of faced a lot of pressure and more price increases than the rural markets. Even when you come here, this is also summarizing the same. The blue are increasing prices, the is it yellow? the kind of declining prices. You can see already that in urban centers, most of the markets were registering increases in prices over time. This is attributable partly to also income differentials between urban and rural areas, as well as the import dependence. Now, at some point, I took kind of a series, or one of the series for some of the markets, and just tried to compute differences in differences indicators to see whether the changes we're seeing were unique to 2022. So we compare the differences from month to month of 2017. So February minus January, March minus February, like that. We list them here and compare them with similar differences for the same period for 2022. I think it's clear here, the ones for 2022 are significant. In terms of absolute numbers, these are very big as compared to this was as percentages. So it's kind of a unique, and the uniqueness in that year, in that part, it was just the war really. Yes, the positives here just show that in general, prices increased more in 2022 for that period than in 2017. 2017 is chosen because it was we took it as a normal year, plus also we had kind of complete data for that period. So the Russia and Ukraine crisis has destabilized markets across the board. And through direct and indirect ways, prices of commodities examined, including wheat, sugar, oil, crude oil, were also affected. These impacts, however, are not uniform across the locations there, but they seem to vary depending on the market. And for urban markets, they seem to be higher than the rural markets, both in terms of volatility as well as in terms of kind of magnitude and direction of change. So it is important to think about social protection programs for both the rural areas as well as the urban centers, because you find people suffering because of the same thing. And it's also important to enhance intra-regional trade, because if you trade more with countries within the region, you are likely going to benefit more and minimize the impacts of any scarcity that is created 10,000 kilometers away. But if you don't, and you close your borders, you're going to just harm the consumers. And at the same time, looking ahead, I think it will be useful to strengthen the agriculture sector, improve productivity. At present, wheat productivity is about 5 tons per hectare in Zimbabwe, but I think other countries, including Egypt, are getting about 8 tons per hectare. It would be good to try to go towards that, that direction. And also it would be useful to increase the diversification of value chains, including maize and wheat, and improving redistribution of gains from the mining sector. I just mentioned the mining sector. There are also other sectors there, like tourism, which are doing good. The mining sector is doing great. And I think through our other status, we see that within a country, the other mining sectors gained a little bit compared to the others. So if in Zimbabwe, improving redistribution would also be great. Redistribution of gains within that sector would be good in saving those who are suffering from the war. Now, Zimbabwe is not just sitting, they're doing a lot of work. This is just a snapshot of some things that they're already doing in order to survive the Russia-Ukraine induced price increases. So, for example, they seem to be trying to switch from, say, if they were importing stuff from Ukraine, they're now importing from Russia if it's easier to do that. So there are some, these are links to that. And also they increased the interest rates to tame inflation, just to make sure they protect the rural, the consumers. They reduced the fuel prices, as I already said, and introduced mandatory blending of fuel with ethanol produced locally. That is just to make sure that they cushion themselves from the international price increases on fuel. And the government also reduced the fuel levies from 12.7 US cents per liter to about 11.4 cents per liter to reduce pressure on traders. And the government is working to support companies with facilitation of funding on raw materials that are subject to duty, just to make sure that some things can be produced in Zimbabwe instead of importing everything. And there are many other things I'm sure that they're doing, but these are some of the stuff that colleagues from the ministry in Zimbabwe shared with me. With that, I've come to the end of this presentation. Over to you, Dr. Chapoto. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greenwell. I think we still have about 30 minutes for discussion. This was interesting, but as your moderator, maybe I should kick off the discussion a little bit and ask you few questions, and then I'll open up the floor. I noticed that the period for analysis is January to May 2022. The war started in February 2022. Would it be fair to say that price transmission here was so fast? I think in terms of how prices were affected in the country, or was it because we were coming out of the COVID period? Then the second question is, if you listen to the president, Zimbabwean president, he says that the country is now wheat self-sufficient. And do you think self-sufficiency is the answer to some in dealing with some of these external shocks? And as a follow-up, what do you think Africa should do as a union in dealing with these challenges? Because what we have seen, I think, is that most of the countries are looking inward rather than looking at the power of the continent as a whole. If you can answer those, then I'll then open up the session to questions. So colleagues online, please feel free to raise your hand or type your question in the chat, and Dr. Machaya can respond to you. So over to you, Greenwell.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chapoto.
Please, could you stop sharing, please?
Oh, okay, sorry. Yes. Dr. Chapoto, thanks very much for the interesting questions and also thought-provoking one. I might not have all the answers for those ones, but I think I would want to say the following. Yes, the transmission of the prices during that time, I think they were faster. Yeah, they were faster. I do not think that it was due to COVID, because for countries actually, including Zimbabwe, as well as Malawi, Zambia, Mozambique, and some of these countries that are where agriculture is kind of a little bit significant, the COVID crisis did not only lead to the general price increases. In some cases, it led to price decline, because you remember the COVID was characterized by low demand. In some studies, I think in some presentations, we have shown that the prices for during the COVID period were, if it was just COVID period, the increases that we are seeing would not have been as such, because that crisis was suppressing demand, whereby this one is kind of suppressing supply. But the effects of the crisis were felt so quickly across the globe because of really the global nature, of the interconnected nature of the countries. And I think the period between January or February to May, it's long enough if you just even think of the way the COVID spread. Within a short period of time, someone says they have viruses in China. Within a week, we're already feeding it elsewhere. And I think that's also about how trade, because that virus was going through trade. That's trade and the flights. So I think for this one, it's almost similar. The period is long. The price signals transmit pretty quickly in this, and that's very important that we have to know that if we do something in our countries, it can quickly also affect other countries, and as far as it's linked to trade. Now, for Zimbabwe, yes, I've also read that the Zimbabwe invested a lot in the agricultural sector, especially in wheat production, and they're expecting a lot of wheat harvests, so they're almost becoming wheat self-sufficient. I guess there are always pros and cons to that. On the one hand, we don't want to produce everything that we want to have, because then we're not going to have the ability to do that. In an average household would want to eat bread, they want to have tea, they want to have coffee, they want to have some fruits, the palms, etc. You can't produce all those. But I think it is a wise idea to look at your consumption patterns and see which commodities you seem to rely so much upon and to what extent you rely on imports, and try to reduce that dependency on imports. So I would still applaud the government for exerting more effort in trying to increase production there. If Zimbabwe produces more, they can always trade with Malawi as well as South Africa. South Africa has a lot of deficit in terms of wheat production. So I think that is something, if it's the case, I think it's a welcome thing. I wouldn't want to say anything to detract from what the president is saying. If they can achieve that self-sufficiency, you can only see that you can only say that it's great. It was very not so convincing to see African leaders during that initial period of time when the war started, talking about complaining so much about the fact that trade is disrupted in Ukraine. I mean, there was nowhere to source wheat within Africa. Is it true that Africa does not have anywhere technical know-how as well as good soils to grow wheat? I think that's not the case. So there's potential within Africa. It would be good to kind of take advantage of the expansive land that is there to grow. So if Zimbabwe is doing that, I think it's a good thing. But this is not an argument against international trade, but it just say if you have the potential, you should go on competitive advantage. You need to engage into that, produce. Not everybody's going to follow suit. If you have a surplus, you're going to sell to other countries. So that's what I would say on that one, Anton. But in terms of Africa as a continent, I think Africa as a continent should really should really try to exert effort in increasing productivity of agriculture in general for many value chains. The good thing, African Union has value chains for each and every country that can do well. There are also studies that showed, I think, that if certain areas we're going to invest more in rice and certain areas we're going to invest more in, say, wheat and others in cassava, then through intra-Africa trade, we would be a continent that is already able to feed itself. I think anything towards that direction would make African Union even very important. If they were able to achieve that, to encourage countries to do that, I think that would be something so I would say focus on how you can increase agricultural production through the Agenda 2063 and the agriculture chapter thereof. Think about how you can come up with finance, because finance seems to be one of the challenges that are preventing Africans from expanding the agricultural sectors, increasing productivity, and also intensify intra-regional trade to make sure that we take advantage of the deficits and surpluses that are there within ourselves, trade as much as possible. I think we are still trading at a lower rate compared to the other continents, to the other, say, the Americas or the Asian or European Union. If we can do that more and we exhaust, or not exhaust, but at least we take advantage of the wider African market and then supply the excess to other countries, that would also be, I think, a great thing. So I think that's what I would say. Over to you
very much.
Yeah.
No, thank you very much, Greeno. I see there's one hand. Gary, please, you can unmute and ask your question.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Dr. Greeno. I guess two questions. So my name is Gary, just calling, I'm dialing in from FCDO.
Okay.
I guess two things I'm interested in. One is, so you highlighted the price difference in urban areas versus rural areas. Is that really a function of, is that just a function of transportation costs, or are there other matters? I mean, I think you also mentioned the dependency on imports, but it'll be good to hear if you think transportation costs play a part in that, or there's also other factors. And then relatedly, I'm also interested in what do you think can be done to boost intra-Africa trade? So I know a lot of agricultural exports from African countries I think they tend to do better at exporting outside of Africa as a continent than exporting within the African continent. It'd be good to hear what your thoughts on what can be done to improve that, particularly from a private sector perspective, and to improve private sector exports to other African countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary. I think we can take some more questions. I think, Lai, you have your hand up.
Yes, Anthony, I just wanted to chip in quickly because my question is sort of related to Gary's first point about the disparity in price hikes between rural and urban areas. He mentioned transportation costs, and I would like Greenwell to perhaps elaborate on the other trends or components that account for these disparities. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take two more questions. I see two more hands, and then we'll allow Greenwell to respond. Then let me give the opportunity to Titi. Please go ahead, and then Julie.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Greenwell, for the presentation. Very interesting study. My question is, to what extent have you also looked at what might be the other reasons for the increase in prices that you were seeing in Zimbabwe in 2022? As you know, Zimbabwe has been experiencing super hyperinflation due to economic mismanagement and the devaluation of the Zimbabwean dollar. So did you look into that? Because that could be also sort of a big reason for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Titi. Julie?
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Greenwell, for the presentation. Very interesting. Greenwell, you had mentioned the need to improve data collection in Zimbabwe. So I was just wondering if, based on your experiences with other countries, you have any best practices or suggestions, or maybe if there's any low-hanging fruit that you could advise the Zimbabwean government to take a look at in order to increase the availability of data. And please feel free to weigh in also, Anthony, on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those are great questions. Reno, please respond.
Okay. So thanks very much. All those great questions. Maybe I don't have answers, so if someone has answers, they will come in, but let me attempt them as follows. So let's start with the price differentials. I think Gary from FCDO, you're very right. When I made the presentation, I attributed the differences to a number of things. One, the general import dependency of the rural urban centers. They don't grow much. Urban agriculture is low. And more often than not, they have to rely on some stuff that is produced or produce that is produced in the rural areas. And secondly, they tend to be also that section of the population that has higher incomes than the other rural areas. And because of that, the effective demand is high, so prices are likely going to be high. But indeed, one of the reasons that I haven't highlighted here, but it's also likely to be the case, is to do with infrastructure and therefore the transaction costs of doing business between the rural areas and the urban centers, especially when you think about importing wheat, say it's wheat flour. If it's imported, firstly, it lands in Harare or in Bulawayo. Then from there, it has to be distributed into the rural areas. Then there has to be a markup price also to some extent there. So that can add to the differential in terms of prices. So transaction costs are key there. The implication being that if we can improve rural infrastructure in terms of connectivity between markets, then those can go down and we can start seeing strong integration of the prices or kind of convergence of prices between urban centers and rural areas over time. That also tries to answer Lai's question that some of these factors that might drive these include the fact that incomes are different between rural areas and urban centers, transaction costs, as Gary also highlighted there, as well as, but one factor might be to do with tastes and preferences, as well as to do, okay, maybe let's hold tastes and preferences at bay, but it might be to do with the availability of substitutes. So if we're talking of, say, wheat and you're in the rural area, I don't think you would find it so difficult to just switch from bread to potato. You can easily do that, and nobody's going to judge you that much. If you're in town, maybe chances that they feel like, should I really be taking tea with potato only? What are the neighbors going to say? If you think of one household and two households doing that, over time, you find that in the urban centers, maybe they will tend to still try and eat that bread, whereby in the rural areas, they'll kind of shun, they will run away from they will leave the bread and think of something else. That is going to be reflected in aggregate demand in the rural areas, and therefore the prices as well. And it can help explain the differential in prices. In terms of improving interregional trade, which is also a very important question, Gary. And this is important because I'm somewhere right now, and in an African country, and I don't want to mention it, but yeah, the first thing we learned is that they produce a lot of sugar in the country, and lots of sugar, but it's only destined for international markets, and the international markets are not in Africa, but in the United States and Europe. So the high-class sugar goes to European countries and the United States. They fetch high prices there. But in Africa, they leave the ones that are low class, including for themselves. So they were just saying the sugar you eat here, although you see the beautiful sugar fields, you might find that it's not the best, maybe, yeah, but it's because we tend not to pay much as Africans for this sugar. So the implication for me there is that if we are to increase this intra-region trade, yes, we have to reduce the tariff and non-tariff barriers as first and foremost, in order to make sure that we can enhance trade between countries and within countries. We reduce all those road harassments, all those corruption, bribery, asking for Fanta if you want to just move with one bag of one truckload of stuff from one border to another. And we also need to improve the infrastructure. You don't have to spend the whole 48 hours in order to clear your cargo from one side of the country to another side of the country. If we improve all that, but beyond that, I think we need to start having the Best Buy African campaign. Now, I'm not saying that by saying that it means we say we shouldn't buy American stuff. No, but I think it's just like typical the way countries do that. So okay, buy British or buy American. Yeah, we can also try to have that, because what I've noted among peers is that we tend to respect more what we buy from outside. So if you say, oh, I bought this, and you say, where did you buy it from? It's from Lilongwe Market. People say, okay. All right. But if you say, no, it's from London, then everyone thinks, okay, it must be good. So we need to, there's something to do there, that maybe spending some effort to convince people that you can buy something from within Malawi or Zimbabwe, manufactured within Zambia or within Senegal, and it's fine. You're not of a lower caliber if you do that. I think that can still contribute something to enhancing inter-region trade, on top of what I've talked about in terms of reducing tariff and non-tariff barriers. So Tsitsi, for the other reasons for the price changes, I think it would be interesting to see what I haven't done in this kind of analysis is that I haven't done, it's not like, we're just looking at the prices. We're not looking at the many factors. We understand that price changes can be a function of many other factors indeed, but we're just trying to look at these factors. If there's anything like you're talking about, like maybe they devalued something, the currency at some point, and maybe that might have affected the prices. I think it would be interesting, but I did not check the kind of recent devaluations in Zimbabwe in order for me to be able to answer this intelligently. But I think it might be very interesting to see what other factors might have also influenced this beyond the crisis that we're thinking about. I'm sorry about that. For Julie, in terms of data, yes, data is an issue in Zimbabwe. I think Zimbabwe does well in many things, but I think even the government itself, the policymakers within government, the ones we interact with, they acknowledge the fact that they would benefit a lot in terms of interventions that would seek to improve availability of data and timely data on prices, data on productivity, data on production, data on soil quality, data on many things. And for some of the practices that might be useful there as just a starting point, I think are related to deliberately building structures that coalesce suppliers of information. So for example, the chapotos, the CAFs, I'm saying the chapoto, the CAFs, the statistical offices, the University of Zimbabwe, and the Solusi University, all those other universities that generate information. It would be useful to have a structure whereby you bring them together in form of a network, and that network interacts regularly with and intentionally with this consumers of information, the Ministry of Agriculture, Finance, etc., all those ministries. And you might think that might not add value, but actually it would add a lot of value, because one, by just bringing them together, you are creating an opportunity to understand their weaknesses and strengths, and they can capitalize on each other. And second, when you make them ready to interface with the consumers of information, you are brokering the knowledge that they produce so that it can be used by the policymakers. And you are also giving the policymakers, the consumers of data, an opportunity to be able to tell these other investors to say, we want to be able to get this and that. We want this information, but we do not have it. What is it that we can do? And they can leverage on those institutions to kind of start generating data. But another one, which I didn't want to say quickly because I don't want to look like we're marketing something. So something that we do, but within the research framework, which academia is leading, we have what we call the regional, the country level local analysis networks. So those local analysis networks, they focus more on how to strengthen data systems at the country level, how to bring together stakeholders that are generating data to understand their strengths and weaknesses, look at gaps, what data is not kind of generated, and what is it that we can do. But also within that framework, create clusters of data within a country. So data on related to nutrition, data related to health, data related to finance, and data related to production. We kind of create clusters around those ones. And then it means each cluster will be working on such kind of data, and it will be easy for us to know, it will be through improvements that are made by each of those clusters, would then be moving towards create a situation where where the country has enough data. I think there are other innovations that might be there, but I just wanted to kind of voice out these ones as a possibility. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Greenwell. Data is key for evidence-based policy making. Unfortunately, what we have seen is, in most cases, that the innovations to try to have collect and store data are usually done as projects rather than as a requirement. It's something that you need in a country, and it doesn't mean that there is no data in the country. People have data, but they use that data as personal information, or they want to have more power than the next person. So there is need to really fully understand that data is a public good, particularly for market information. To me, I think it's very important. So I think having these networks where we collaborate and coordinate in terms of collecting data and having that data available for people to use for decision making is very key. But we have to look at the sustainability of any of these strategies that we put across. I think we have 5 minutes left. So I have Antoinette. hand up. Julie and Gary, are those hands new or they are legacy hands?
It's a leftover. Oh, I'll lower
It's
it.
a leftover. Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. So let's have Antoinette. And if there's anybody else who wants to speak, please raise your hand now because we'll allow freedom to answer.
Okay, thank you.
We think you can close up. Yeah.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you all the participants for the thought-provoking questions and of course the answers from Dr. Macheta. My question is about fertilizer. One of the key inputs in crop production is fertilizer, and most of it in many African countries, I think, including Zimbabwe, is imported. Why wasn't the price of fertilizer included in your study? And if it was, I didn't say it, what has been the impact on the Zimbabwean economy? Thank you.
So Greenwell, you have 1 minute to answer that question.
Yeah, so sorry. Thanks very much, Antoinette. That's a very good question. This, you're very right. Is fertilizer shock is one of the shocks that we are going to be worried about, and I think it will even become worrisome in this year as well as in the years to come, because without fertilizer, there's nothing much that we can do in the medium term. Unfortunately, for this one, we are not able to get data on fertilizer prices for monthly or weekly from Zimbabwe at the time that we are doing this. But yes, fertilizer prices have now continued to rise, as I kind of saw, and unfortunately we did not present anything there. We wanted to present something that is in the brief, and when we drafted the brief, we did not have data from the market information systems in Zimbabwe. But I agree, this is something that we need to focus much on.
Yeah, and Antoinette, usually you find that fertilizer is usually linked to the production season, which starts late in the year, sometime around October, November, December. That's where you find issues of fertilizer prices start to creep in, based on the period that this brief is concerned with. January to May, it may probably was too early for fertilizer prices to be a big shock in the country, and that's similar, I think, in some of the other countries as well. But I think if we maybe look back now, we should be able to look at how the war impacted, I think, fertilizer prices. We have 2 minutes. And I would like to utilize these 2 minutes. I think there was a question to Greenwell by Gary on regional trade. I just wanted to add something. I think basically, I think for us to be able to really increase the regional trade, it's important to make sure that there is production. Because you see, our production is very erratic. So if we are producing goods and services that do not, in terms of supply, are not very consistent, it's very difficult to really trade consistently. And also you find that it may be cheaper to import, to get deep sea imports than to trade between, say, Zimbabwe and Zambia, because the road network is bad, there's no rail system. So there are certain things, the infrastructure developments that are required. So it may be important for us to start supporting regional value chains, to say, okay, this region focuses on this, and this can be distributed across the continent. There are so many other things to make sure that we look at the the inter-regional trade in Africa. So that's very important. I think the last thing I might say is to maybe just thank Greenwell. It was nice having you, and you as your moderator. It was great discussion. But before we close, let me bring it back to Lai to say the final. Yes, she should have the final word on this. But otherwise, I enjoyed the session. Thank you very much. Back to you, Lai.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Anthony, for first of all for agreeing to moderate this session and for being the driving force between such an interactive session. Thank you again, Greenwell, for coming back again for yet another presentation, and I'm sure we're going to have you again before we wrap up this series. So thank you for your rich presentation. And of course, to all our participants, thank you for keeping the conversation going, for your questions, for your reflections and your contributions. It's always a delight to have you here with us. So it's a wrap for session 16. Join us same time next week for session 17 of the Ukraine Crisis webinar series. And as you can see in the chat, next week, we are going to discuss global commodity trade and market disruptions, impacts on growth, food security and poverty in Rwanda. We will have a presentation by Dr. Ismail Fofana, who is Director of Capacity and Deployment at Academia 2063. And the session will be moderated by Mr. Claude Bizimana, who is the CEO of Rwanda's National Agricultural Export Development Board. So you don't want to miss that session. Thank you all. And of course, head to the chat, head to click the link to SlideShare to gain access to all the PowerPoints from this webinar series. And visit academia2063.org to get the briefs from our Ukraine Crisis portal. Follow us at Academia 2063 on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you, and see you next time. Bye.
Thank you very much, Lai. Thanks very much, Antoine, and thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.